Our presenters have shared with us, the IFPRI people, IFPRI colleagues have shared with us their thinking on the new research program. And we've heard from Ira and Karina what are some of the key issues and areas to look forward to. We'd like to hear from you. What are your reactions to these ideas, research areas to look into, the questions we pose? Are there questions we should be looking at that are not already addressed here? How do we make this research happen? And this is exactly, we are presenting the beginning of work. Let me say it, not Marie. We are literally looking for partners and sponsors and donors for this work. So I'd also like to hear ideas from you. So let's take a first round, and as we do that, please, we have people with mics who will come to you. Raise your hand, give us your name and institution, and let's take a few of them, and we'll go from there. I see Klaus at the back there. Would you pass a mic to him, please? That's coming, and then if other colleagues would give me a signal, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Klaus von Grebmer from IFPRI. Marie, I was excited when you started with bad diets are the source of malnutrition or are the reason for malnutrition. And then I would have expected the next question is, what are the main drivers of bad diets? So you say bad diets are the driver of malnutrition, but who looks into the drivers or the main drivers of bad diets?
Thank you very much, Klaus. Marie, do you want to address this question right away while the room warms up?
Basically, this was Jeff's presentation, showing that there are personal, individual drivers that influence the choices you make when you purchase food. And he explained the kind of issues related to the need for convenience if you work and other, just the pressure from the environment sometimes also affects what you choose. So that was the idea, was to show that there are individual drivers, there are household drivers, and then there's the food environment, which hits you from so many different ways by these advertisements, by just making the food available, but also showing it in Mexico. I've seen a picture of Coca-Cola being in the same area as fruit and vegetables. It's right there. It's like, this is healthy. You're here. You want to buy some fruit and vegetables. Also buy your Coca-Cola. It's good for you. So those are the drivers, and we certainly want to understand better what is most important. Is it your preference? Is it the supermarkets also have better prices? So you go to the supermarket, and that's where you get hit with all of the ultra-processed food. So there are several factors at all of those levels, and we want to entangle those and understand in different contexts what is most important. And so there we can see what are the leverage points for intervention.
Thank you very much, Marie. Jeff, did you want to add anything? Or okay, I come back to the room, and there's a hand right there. Drew, if you'd pass.
Hi, Sunny Kim from PHND. Thank you for the presentations, and I think the focus is certainly on the food systems, and then at the individual level up to food choice and diets. But the other side of the nutrition and urban nutrition is physical activity, sedentary lifestyle, transportation, and all those elements. And I wondered how that fits into the agenda.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to tackle that question too, any of the panelists, you're more than welcome to.
A very good question. It is obviously getting overweight obese is a balance between what you consume and your energy expenditure. It's on our radar, but we somehow have to choose what the primary focus will be on. And for this program, I think the primary focus will be on understanding how we can improve the diets, the quality of diets of the poor, changing the built environment, making sure that people have a place to work out, that transportation, you can bike, you can walk. It's not really the focus of this program. It is definitely something we're aware of and will pay attention to as we develop this work.
Thank you Very much. I understand we have several online questions. I'd like to ask my colleague Lucy to read them out to us.
Okay, thank you. So we have questions from 3 online audience members. First is Pandisha from Tanzania. How can we ensure food quality under the market-driven economy as we see most of the countries invest on producing an abundance of food without putting consideration on quality in terms of nutritional value? The second is Naji from Dubai, UAE. Is there any plan to adopt virtual water theory as part of the SDGs? And then the third is from Toyib from Mohammed VI Polytechnic University, Morocco. This question is for Danielle concerning people living in the slums and cities. How do we include them in planning for food and nutrition security? And another one is to Jeff from the same person. What's your view about school feeding programs in schools in relation to food security? There are different views about whether government should invest in them given the financial requirements. Thank you.
Wonderful questions from the online audience. Let me come back to the room over here. And Marie, would you like to begin and then spread them to the panelists, or shall we do it the other way around? The first question is about assuring food quality in market-driven economies, and perhaps, Lucy, you could repeat that?
From Pandisha, it's how can we ensure food quality under the market-driven economy as we see most of the countries invest on producing an abundance of food without putting consideration on quality in terms of nutritional value?
Excellent, Jeff.
I don't pretend to have the answer, but some countries, especially in Latin America, are heavily focusing on this now. I believe Chile has introduced a system where there's labeling, front of package labeling with very visible black signs if foods don't meet requirements. I believe it's related to sugar, fat, and salt, but I might be mistaken on the specifics there. And the cutoffs for those labels progressively become stricter. And what they've seen in Chile is that some of the food producers have reformulated some of the foods they offer because they do not like their foods to be branded with these labels front of package. So I think this is one strategy to go about that.
On the reformulation, I find it actually quite scary. It's clear that the industry will respond to the demand. They don't want to be tagged as having foods that's too high in sugar and doesn't have micronutrients. So, they'll put a bunch of micronutrients in there, and they will say that this is healthy, but at the same time it's healthy it has micronutrients, but then it provides 1,000 calories per gram or something. It's really a very difficult to control and manage and have all of the information that we need about these reformulations to be able to determine whether, and I always say there's no food that's healthy, or it's not that food is healthy or unhealthy, it's your diet. If you eat just a little bit of something that's unhealthy, nothing's going to happen. But it's the diet is how you bring different foods together. And if you only eat ultra-processed food, and some people we know do that, then of course you cannot have a good diet because they're all too high in starting with salt and then sugar and saturated fats that we don't necessarily eat if we eat diets that are made from real food, as they say.
Danielle, James, go ahead, and then Danielle, and back to you, Jeff, for the other question.
So I think I was just going to add that, obviously education programs and food regulations, these are essential interventions, but they're also sort of more traditional market interventions like trade policy and industrial policy to protect domestic suppliers of healthier foods and so on. Often the deck is stacked against the smaller players, and it's import restrictions on ultra-processed foods in places like Africa are not fully enforced. And so I think there's a lot of role to play. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and some benefits that can be achieved if we work with governments to show what kind of regulations, what kind of policies would be most conducive to promoting sort of healthier, locally sourced foods and maybe less processed foods. And so that's really where we see our component on rural-urban linkages, working together with different ministries to design policies that look at these bigger sort of economic issues.
Okay, I'll respond to the particular question from Morocco on making slums and the urban poor are more inclusive, with better access to diets. And I mean, in many cities that I'm familiar with, you do have many of these informal markets that I was talking to within slums or informal communities. They're right there, and they are the main source of food because of access, because of price. The challenge, as I mentioned, is the infrastructure, which really affects the food quality. And as we saw from the, I think it was the Safe Food Imperative report that came out from the World Bank a few months ago, was emphasizing, particularly a lot of African governments have focused on food quality standards for export markets, but they haven't really focused on domestic food safety issues. And so I do think a lot more attention to the built environment, the infrastructure within these markets, making sure your food preparers have clean water, that they can actually wash their utensils, that you actually do have functioning toilets for traders to use. But that involves a lot of the political leadership Karina was alluding to, and actually reinvesting the revenue that's collected back into those markets.
Thank you. Jeff, did you want to come back on the school feeding question?
Sure. Even though this is not by no means my area of expertise, I think it's a policy instrument that is useful to keep children in school, to make sure that when they are in school, they've had breakfast, so they can focus those first hours of the day. What I've heard are challenges related to the quality of what is actually provided. The dietary quality, the food safety of what is being provided, I think there's a lot that needs to be developed there. But again, this is not my area of expertise, so I don't want to say more than I know.
Would you like to make a comment also?
I can just add quickly that we had a meeting at IFPRI maybe a month ago or so that was reporting on a survey that is made in a large number of schools. And the survey is not very detailed, but it does collect information about the kinds of food that are included in the school meals. And so there is some movement in terms of trying to have a little bit more information and maybe control over the quality of food in school.
Sure, just to add that there are great opportunities for homegrown school feeding through school feeding programs. There is evidence that providing meals at school increases pupils' attendance levels and concentration. Where the discussion comes in whether it has a nutrition impact, because it's outside the critical period for nutrition interventions, but they're definitely beneficial.
Wow, that's an interesting
It could have impact on micronutrients, just for the record. Yeah.
Let me come back to the room, and then I will again go with another round. I'd seen Anne Tutterweiler's hand up there. Mary, would you pass the mic to Anne, and then to the gentleman next to her?
Thank you. Anne Tutweiler, Senior Fellow with Meridian Institute. Just a couple of points I wanted to make. I think the only person who mentioned water was IFPRI in the World Bank paper, and I just want to say I'm now sitting on the board of the International Water Management Institute, who has an urban agriculture focus in their new strategy, so I would encourage IFPRI to talk to IMI about how they might work together, because it's all around water safety, water quality, which is really critical in this, as you pointed out. The second point, I wanted to go back to one of the online questions about the markets, and relative food prices are certainly also a big driver of the choices people make, and I don't need to tell anybody at IFPRI about that. But it strikes me also that there's a link to the work that IFPRI and others are doing on food losses and waste, because we know that food losses and waste are higher in the areas of fruits and vegetables and fresh products. So that's another area where maybe an internal link to other parts of IFPRI's program. And then just from my former hat as Director General of Biodiversity International, this issue around diversification of our food systems and the link, as you pointed out, to this peri-urban area where a lot of those types of food can be grown. I didn't hear that emphasized enough, is how can we actually, through urban food systems, help to incentivize a more diversified agriculture and more diversified consumption. So thanks.
Thank Thank you very
No,
much,
not a
Anne.
question, sorry.
Including the suggestions for partners, and that's something we'll welcome. Please pass the mic to the gentleman here in the same row, and then.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin, and I have a lot to say, so I'm going to try to unpack it slowly.
Ask you to be very brief to allow
Okay,
everyone else.
that's why I'm going to try to just be brief. I started my career in food at culinary school in New York City, and I became a personal chef through that, and I decided that I wanted to do more, so I went to the new school for food study. And through that, I've had the chance to go to Quito, to Habitat 3, study in the Dominican Republic, food systems. And I've had a chance to travel extensively. And one thing that I understand coming from the urban poor of my community is that it's not about what's available. It's more about, number one, I don't like the term poor because it makes the person feel like they're the one that has to make the change, but it's more like the urban preyed upon or the urban targeted, because it's traditions and it's addictions that are fueling the poor diets of my community that I have seen personally be affected by these things. And it's not just having these things available, but it's more about the understanding. And the same way we look at prescription drugs and they have labels of side effects, the same thing with sugar. It's a huge drug that has addicted and corrupted so many people, but we don't look at it as that way. Also, I feel that as many of these meetings I've sat in, we don't really come up with a concrete attack on how to stop people from being targeted versus putting things there for them to make their own choices, where it's so hard. Your family is entrenched in this tradition. You're preyed upon through advertising, through drugs that are addictive, salt, fat, sugar, and no one really fully comprehends. That's been my experience, because when I go back and I talk to people that I love and I know, it really doesn't click. It's not something that we understand here, but it just doesn't click when they see everybody they know, and they're not fat, but they eat, this stuff. So it doesn't register in the same way that we present it. And I just think that there has to be a more offensive approach to how people are being targeted.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for sharing that and the traditions and addictions.
Thank you.
To that. There is a hand at the back further down, and then I will come to Rob here.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Che Axon. I'm Director of Urban Ag and Gardening Education for the University of District of Columbia. In this country, we have land-grant institutions, so I guess, Jeff, my question would be to you, when you're in Ghana, what roles are universities playing in helping solving some of these problems that you could see, or anybody could answer that, universities or, that level of cooperative help to solve these problems?
Thank you very much. Let me come to my colleague Rob Voss here, and then I will take James from the World Bank next.
Thanks. So after the previous intervention before the last one, I'm afraid to ask a sort of a mundane question in our but the question is either to Marie or to Jeff. The first question, second to James on ultra-processed food. So I know some countries use ultra-processed food as the extreme bad food, but of course it sounds like we should stop processing food altogether. Not all ultra-processed foods are bad. What you're referring to is the ones that have too much sugar, bad fats, or too much salt, right? So, and given that some countries label all ultra-processed foods as bad, like Brazil has in their healthy diets definition, it would be a dangerous route to say, well, they're all bad, right? So maybe we should have another category and to group them together. It brings me to the second question for James on, you want to levy import tariffs on ultra-processed foods. Probably that would bring us into trouble with WTO rules and so on. Might be a good idea to think of bad foods to link it to food safety rules, or like Trump likes to raise tariffs on Canada for national security reasons, we may lift or put tariffs on bad foods for whatever, nutrition security, or maybe a good idea. But the point being is that whether tariffs would be the way to go, I would rather leave to the previous question, look at the price and tax policies as probably more effective instrument than tariffs.
Thank you very much, Rob. I hesitate to ask this to the panel, but I know two more hands had come up. If you'll allow me, let's take them together. James, you were next, and then the gentleman behind Rob.
Yes, thank you very much. I guess some of the previous comments. Yes, my name is James Teft, so I work for FAO's Investment Center, and I'm seconded to the World Bank, where I work on urban food issues. I think a number of issues that the people have raised. First, Corina said she's shocked by the lack of evidence. And I think that's really important as you think about this program, the lack of impact assessments. I mean, every day we see in the press anecdotal ad hoc information, and you can drown yourself in that, but kind of the hard figures in all of these areas, I think, is something to take forward. Kevin had made a comment about the urban space, and I think a lot of the decisions, and will cut across all of your areas, is importance of land use planning and zoning, and I think in each of these areas, understanding this element is so critical. And it'll probably take an effort to move beyond your rural agriculture comfort zone, but I think it is so important, and you start to interact with some of the people that have worked in this space, and I think you'll start to see this importance. I think when you think of partnerships, and in some of the work that we've been doing in the bank, is you see behind the scenes of these dynamic cities very focused, outreach-oriented academic and research institutions. And it's not something where they produce a report, they assume that it'll get to the policymakers, but it's really action-oriented. I mean, you can start here in North America, I mean, places like Ryerson in Toronto, or Johns Hopkins or CUNY, but also in South Africa and Cape Town. I think also in Ghana, there are probably some examples. And so think about fostering those relationships and understanding how they're really engaged in that action space. And then fourth, I think, and I know that Danielle had a previous life, and some of her insights working in the political economy, because I think, and this is, I think, a challenge for the bank, has been thinking about, and I think as Ira had mentioned, we've thought about food and agriculture from a national level, and so all of a sudden we have these municipalities that are starting to become an actor. And so to understand the political economy about policy, but also about politics, the city vis-a-vis the national element, or in federal systems, kind of state authorities. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Let me take the last intervention from our colleague there.
Yes, my name is Omar Dari from USAID, the Division of Nutrition and Environmental Health. I would like to comment that in the environment I move, there is some misunderstanding sometimes about what is urbanization. And then when we talk about markets, we are talking only about processed foods. We are missing really the link between agriculture of the rural areas and the urban areas. And that was the presentation by James Thorlock, which was very important. When you comment that if we put and switch our attention and funds only to the urban areas and neglecting part of the rural areas, both are going to be affected. And that message is not clear. Could you elaborate a little more about that?
Analysts, we have an incredibly rich set of comments and questions. I would ask you, pick the ones that are most relevant to you, and then have a conversation in the break afterwards. Let me begin with you, Ira, and walk this way down. And Marie, you will have the last, I'll come to you last. Ira, is there anything you wish to comment on?
Just to briefly say that it's impossible to think about urban food systems without thinking and disconnecting them from urban, rather from the rural development agenda. We will always be thinking about smallholder farmers and how to address food security and objectives of the agriculture sector that are more traditional, sort of productivity and increasing revenues and incomes for farmers. That will always be part of the discussion, even if we're finally paying more attention now to urban food systems issues.
Thank you. I hope I jotted down the questions. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. On the Ghana academic world, there is a very dynamic and growing group of nutrition researchers in Ghanaian universities. And their work really ranges from assessing diets to mapping these food environments all the way to looking and evaluating the policies that Ghana has on the books. So it's I hope they ultimately have impact and start to change things at the policy level. I want to quickly comment on relative food prices. I definitely agree that's something to look into. What was eye-opening to me in the study that I shared that just came out yesterday, that in a lab setting where people could just eat what they wanted, the ultra-processed food group consumed a lot more than the unprocessed food group. So there was nothing. It was not related to prices. It was clearly related to what's more appealing to us humans. So I think that's a challenge or addictive. On the ultra-processed foods, the definitions have shifted over time a couple of times, and I wouldn't be surprised if the NOVA classification continues to be sharpened. But we need to make sure that we distinguish between processed foods. Most foods we consume are processed. If you pull a vegetable out of the ground, you've done some processing already. These are ultra-processed foods that have some industrial ingredients. I think that's key to the definition. But I agree, more sharpening of that definition will probably happen. And lack of impact assessment, absolutely, that's something we also have identified as a big hole in the evidence and something we would like to contribute to filling.
Well, yeah, thanks very much. I'm not being totally naive in suggesting tariffs on ultra-processed foods. What I was thinking more is about enforcement. So, for example, we've been working in Tanzania with in the edible oil sector, and there are import restrictions on imported palm oil, but they aren't being enforced, right? And so a lot of it is not necessarily putting in new taxes, but it is about enforcing the restrictions that are in there. And often it's the larger players that are able to sort of exact these special treatments or avoid the taxes. And I think there's a lot of role to play for domestic taxes as well. So if we think about promoting animal-sourced foods, locally sourced animal-sourced foods, then again, in Tanzania, one of the things that we found is that the large players have managed to get their VAT back on animal feed, which is a key part of the livestock sector, whereas the smaller informal players don't have that mechanism to get the taxes back. And so I think there are some, zero rating animal feed would be one way of really injecting sort of greater competitiveness into the local, smaller players. So that's kind of along the lines we're going. So yeah, but I'm not a trade economist, so I guess I do walk into these traps. On the lack of evidence, and I think it speaks to Kevin's question as well, I think one of the things that strikes me, Karina was talking about sort of urban gardening, and we've been talking about educational change, behavioral change programs, and so on. But Karina also mentioned these large-scale integrated programs, and some of these, I guess you'd call them top-down programs. And maybe, and here's my question, and I think this is something we need to address, we need to gather evidence about the relative effectiveness of these two, the two approaches, the sort of micro-household level interventions versus the top system level change. And it is quite possible that they probably have to work together, but it's possible that some of those large-scale top-down may be more transformative and breaking some of that traditional sort of lock-in that's in some of these urban food systems, perhaps. But that would be one avenue to explore. And then finally, around the urban poverty, and this was work that we did together with the Malawian government, who was revising their new urban development plan. And in Malawi, and this was together with the World Bank, and Malawi is very much opposed to urbanization. It's explicitly written into their national development plan. One of the goals is to slow down and stop, if possible, urbanization, because they're worried about the absorptive capacity of these urban areas and an urbanization of poverty. And so one of the things we were showing is that urbanization can be very positive for economic development in the country, but that if you don't adjust your national development plan to invest in urban areas, then you do run a greater risk of an urbanization of poverty. But with scarce resources, if your knee-jerk reaction is to raid agriculture in order to pay for urban development, then you actually end up with this perverse effect of higher food prices, higher poverty, and so on. And so it is about finding that careful balance, and it isn't easy, and it's going to be a negotiated solution. So one of the implications for us is that we do need to work with city governments, and we need to work with, if we want to talk about peri-urban development and peri-urban agriculture, we need to work with the district governments that have jurisdiction over those outlying areas, and we need to work with both ministries of agriculture and trade and industry. So there's a huge coordination game and a challenge for us to sort of work with a whole set of new partners, as was said. Thank you.
Okay, well, appreciate all the comments and feedback, and I really take James's point on about really looking at land use planning and zoning. That's a real another issue that explains differentiation in some of the outcomes we see with informal food trade, whether the land is actually owned by a chief, like a lot of the markets in Kumasi are owned by the Ashanti chief, or if it's privately owned or under government tenure. My previous life is still my current life. I'm still looking at political economy issues, and I do think there are a number of political issues we can be integrating into the program. If we are looking at cities as kind of a unit of policy engagement, just even understanding, are your mayors appointed? Are they elected? Do mayors actually have the autonomy to do some of the initiatives, Karina, we're talking about, or are they actually governing in a coalition? And in a real challenge, we have a number of African cities I focus on are actually governed by an opposition party. And so you have this challenge of what's called vertically divided authority, where you have a different party at different levels, and the national government does not have an incentive to help mayors with healthy food programs or any types of initiatives that would give opposition mayors clout and particularly a foothold to compete in subsequent elections. So we will certainly be considering a lot of these political economy issues.
Mary, I'd like to ask you to answer any of the remaining questions or any questions. And then as a program leader, what are your thoughts on how we move this research forward?
Well, that's not what I was planning to talk about. But anyway, I thought the answers to the questions were fine, and I'm pleased that two people, aside from us here, researchers, have mentioned the importance of data and of evaluation. And really, when Corinna digs out all of these examples, I get almost angry that these things exist. We don't know anything about them. I don't know where she finds the information, actually, and we just don't learn if we don't have any data and measurement and evaluation. And we don't need to evaluate everything. We can just evaluate some of them and get so much information in just a few good evaluations. So that is certainly a point that is very close to my heart, and I was really happy that we didn't have to say it. Other people said it. At the same time, we do have real lack of interest from donors. First, in the area of urban, they don't really know where it fits in their strategies. It's kind of a cross-cutting issue, but then they don't know where it fits. And they're just not into big data exercises, and that's the other problem that we have. When we say, give us a chance to show to you how much information we can get, and how much that would help for any action that we're trying to make. So that's where we should go, get funding and do the case studies we want to do, and get a chance to just inform through action-oriented data and evaluations, and then show the world that it was well worth it and we need to do a lot more of it. Every city will be unique. It's going to be really hard to do any generalization from one city to the other city. It always ends up being case studies. So that's another challenge that we would have to face, is how we make a story or how we learn really something that is not just in that city, but that's generalizable. The one thing I wanted to come back to is the point I made that I couldn't explain at the time because I didn't have my extra 3 minutes. So I want to explain why the problem of poor diets and obesity and related cardiovascular diseases and diabetes and non-communicable diseases are so much worse in low and middle income countries, and why they lead to mortality so much more than in other countries. there is an interaction, a very, very important interaction between early life nutrition and later life nutrition and susceptibility, and that's what's happening. So basically in the country, in low and middle income countries, a lot of the population currently has been undernourished during early childhood. They have been, it may have started in utero or in the first 2-3 years. And this makes them more susceptible to becoming overweight and obese at adulthood with even less exposure, or, you know, they're more susceptible. They're more likely to become obese, and this is a very well demonstrated fact. And then if they get overweight and obese, they're more likely to get the chronic diseases. There's another, I mean, people call it a toxicity of obesity. Obesity is more toxic among people that suffered from undernutrition in early life. And so then they get those diseases, and of course in low and middle income countries, they're not ready to absorb all of this chronic diseases all of a sudden. They were still dealing with food insecurity and undernutrition, and now their hospitals are full of people that have diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. So they're less likely to be treated for it, therefore they die more, and if they're treated, they may not be well treated. So that's a very important fact for all of us to understand, that where we want to work is in low and middle income countries that are in real trouble right now. And there's just so much we can do in one generation. We can't save those people right now. We have to save their children for the future generations, because that one generation is going to be really a multiple duty to try to figure out a way to eliminate this huge problem that we have. On that note.
On that note, I hope that all of you are very excited, intrigued, inspired by the research proposal that has been essentially shared here, by the importance and the urgency of this work. You have ideas for how we may take this work forward, and that, as Marie said earlier in her remarks, give us a chance to do this pioneering work. I hope that you will join us in making this work possible. Thank you very much, everyone.